Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So, welcome back to my weekday videos where I do interesting conversations and interviews with various prominent individuals about storytelling and culture. Today, I have a conversation with Chuck Dixon, but before I get there, I just want to thank everyone who has ordered my graphic novel, The Valiant Heroes. The campaign is gone into demand on Indiegogo. Despite a shadow ban by Indiegogo itself, the campaign did fairly well, and we certainly rallied in that last day. You're looking at some of the beautiful art from that campaign in the background. It is an 82-page, all ages superhero spectacular that focuses on epic storytelling and fun. And also, Crom the Destroyer, which I'll show some art for that in the background as well. My new campaign will be starting in about 6 months, so I'm going to put up the sign-up list for that as soon as possible so you can leave your email and I will inform you when the project goes live. So, with that all out of the way, on to my interview with Chuck. All right, so welcome back to my series of interviews and conversations with prominent individuals about storytelling and culture. Today, I have with me Chuck Dixon, a very prominent voice within comics and a very prolific writer, creator of some iconic characters like Bane and writer of iconic characters like Batman. Welcome to the Fourth Age, Chuck.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I usually like to start off just by getting a grasp on what kind of stories my interviewees like to read, or what their favorite story is. So I just want to ask that question right off the top. If you could pick something which is not something that you have written, but others have written, what would be your favorite story?
I always go back to a story I loved when I was a kid. The first Batman story I really fell in love with. It was a story called "The Strange Costumes of the Batman," which I found reprinted in an 80-page giant when I was a kid, and I really liked it. And I've riffed on it quite a bit in my career with different characters.
So when you started writing, I just wanted to know, did you have any technical instruction before you started writing? I know that I interview every once in a while an artist, and they do have, a lot of technical training within, sequential art or other things that have to do with training within sequential art that have to do with cartoons. But what would be your background before you began professionally writing?
Well, I just, as far as technical, I'm a high school graduate, had a little bit of community college. Mostly, I just read a lot. Um, so, that's how I prepared. As far as writing comics, when I was getting in, there was no place to go for instruction. You just sort of had to learn as you go along and pick up whatever you could find.
Well, that answers my next question, which would be how much are you self taught? So I take it that you are completely self taught, which is an extremely good way to I'd say, involve yourself within a medium so much that you want to write in it. Um, so my other question off of that and your inspirations for writing to begin with, you just mentioned one old Batman story. When you began to write professionally for the bigger companies, I think you started off with Comico and then moved around a little bit until you got to Marvel. What were there any specific artists that you were trying to copy their style for, since you are self-taught?
Well, I mean, a big influence on me was Archie Goodwin when I was a kid, reading his horror comics. They just seemed like pure comics to me. Perfect mix, a perfect combination of words and pictures. And he really allowed the artist to tell the stories. And back then, a lot of times, the writers would basically override the art in a lot of cases. You had a lot of comics where the characters talked a lot. In Archie's comics, it all seemed more natural and organic. So that's the way I wanted to write comics, in a more cinematic way. And that's what, basically that was the template for me. As far as writers I looked at as contemporaries when I was breaking in, for me, Mike Barron was the guy to beat. Mike Barron had set the bar with Nexus, and that was the guy to emulate. and try to be more like. And he was from the Archie Goodwin school as well. So, using more cinematic techniques to tell comic stories than the yak 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 and meanwhile back at the Batcave kind of writing.
So I take it from your answer so far, you were definitely a comic book kid.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I read comics before I could read, so there were always comics around, and I was kind of my parents were sort of ahead of themselves. They encouraged me to read comics to help me with my reading.
So, jumping forward a little bit, I want to talk about your introduction into Marvel. I believe it was Larry Hama that brought you in 1985. I just want to talk about for a moment the kind of atmosphere that was there when you first went in. I had just listened to an interview with Bobby Chase. You probably worked with Bobby Chase while you were at Marvel. She did an interview for Marvel
Yeah.
for their website about 6 months ago, 8 months ago, and she was told. Well, she said that originally she answered a job posting, and then when she got in there, um, she was told, "Okay, here's the job for you, but check your politics at the door." Was that something that was told you, or was that something that was understood when you first got into comics, or was it even a conversation that needed to be had?
Yeah, no, nobody ever said don't talk politics. The only time the subject of politics came up was when I was at DC because Denny O'Neil was so famously political. But you were free to have an opinion. It didn't affect your career in any way. And certainly Denny and I disagreed on a lot of things, but we were friends and we worked well together. We didn't let it affect the work. Everything was all about the comics, really. And I think saying keep the politics out of here was basically saying, don't be a bore.
So, on that vein about moving into Marvel, into mainstream comics, how would you say, because you worked both under the editorship of Jim Shooter and Archie Goodwin, um, how much influence did they have on the writing style that you developed?
Well, Jim Shooter, not so much because I was kind of in Larry Hama's camp. You know, Larry Hama literally had this office way back in a corner, and Jim Shooter really had no interest in anything Larry was doing. I mean, Larry was doing GI Joe, he was doing Conan, he was doing things like that, and Shooter's venue was the Marvel universe, and he really didn't care. I mean, I'm sure he appreciated the fact that Larry's projects were making a lot of money for the company, but other than that, there was no interference. The two of them were in two different lanes. As far as Archie Goodwin, I mean, always an influence. Archie always had a better idea. If there was a weak part in your story, he could find it in an instant and always had a suggestion to perfectly fix it. Um, but he was, for the most part, and he and Larry both, for the most part, were hands-off editors. Unless you were making a horrible mistake, they didn't really step in.
So my introduction to Alien Legion from Marvel was the second series that came out, which is what you worked on, and it was edited by Archie Goodwin. And now I remember specifically, I think it was the first issue. He did a letter page on the back of the front cover where he said that the original series. It just didn't resonate as much with the audience as they had hoped. And in his words, it died a natural death. And so they were going to revamp, and they weren't going to get the same stories as from the first run. It's going to be something new and exciting because the audience wanted something different. So to me, that struck a chord when I read that. Again, I had went through the series a couple of years ago, just again, and I read that once more and said to myself, was it always, well, I suppose for Archie, but for anybody else, always the sales that come first? Because that line where he said, it died a natural death because no one was buying it, was that the final end all and be all of, can I continue to write this comic?
Well, I mean, it's a business. They want to make money. I mean, I personally want to make sure I'm reaching an audience. As much as I'm amusing myself when I write these comics, I still want them to amuse other people. Also, I want to keep on doing it. So there has to be a reason for it. There has to be an audience, and yeah, you've got to seek that out. I think more and more the major comic book companies are getting away from caring about the audience, and you really do have to think about who's reading these, what do they like, what do they not like. Comics in particular, more than I think any other medium, is shaped by the fans, and you want to give them more of what they want, and I have no problem.
It's very interesting. I had just done a couple of weeks ago an interview with a former artist for Marvel. She had just left Marvel a couple of years ago, and she was talking about her training as a sequential artist and how sequential art is a part of commercial art. Commercial art is there to tell a story in order to sell a product, and I find that that sort of mentality again is just not there today within comics. I don't know so much on the writing side and on the artistic side as well. But that was again, I would say front and center if you look at stuff like Archie Goodwin's statements. So I just wanted to stick that in there. But other than that, I just wanted to ask a couple of other questions about when you moved from Marvel and DC, from mainstream into indie comics. Do you find that you have much more of a creative license when you're writing indie comics, or did you enjoy the structure of someone saying, "Okay, this is how far you can go," so you can play with the internal parts of your story?
Well, first, I want to respond to, I want to clarify what I said before. I mean, when I'm writing, it's not this cold calculation of what does the audience want, and I want to give them exactly what they want, like I'm checking boxes or it's a grocery list. Um, I just write earnestly, and I think that's the key. If you write earnestly and care about the characters and you're passionate about the work, that'll come across to the readers. I don't want to make it sound like these are just cold equations to to get readers money. So I mean, I want to write the kind of comics that I enjoyed, and hopefully other people will enjoy. So there's a bond there. In comics, in the end, comics is kind of an intimate medium where there's a bond between the creators and the fans, and so I don't want to make it all sound like it's a business proposition. It never was with me. It was never about the money. It was just I love the medium. But as far as independent comics, I had a lot of freedom at Marvel and DC. Like I said, Larry Hama, Archie Goodwin, also Denny O'Neil were mostly hands-off editors. They allowed you to take on these franchises and see. They wanted to know what you were going to do with them. They wanted to see where you were going. They were interested in your take. And I got very little pushback or micromanaging or things like that from those editors. And so, yeah, at the independence, if you're creating it yourself, you have all the freedom. You're the boss, and that's cool. But writing Batman or the Punisher or whatever, I mean, I was encouraged to be more creative, not less creative, and I was encouraged to like just run with whatever it is you want to do. Just follow your heart on this stuff, even though these are corporate owned, entities. I was allowed to basically run wild with them.
So, was there a character or characters that you enjoyed the most in writing?
I still have a strange affinity for the Punisher. I don't know what that says about me, but he was always the easiest character for me to write. He's the only character that I still come up with stories for, even though I'm not paid to do so. I mean, in my head, I think of Punisher stories all the time.
It's very interesting. I just wanted to talk about, well, I would say your biggest creation or your most well-known creation, which would be Bane for a minute. Um, I find that now I remember when Bane came out, and I remember the world in which Bane came out in, and it was very much a world where we had been hearing about for a decade or so. Um, People in the Olympics using steroids, and then you had things blowing up in baseball, and you had congressional hearings. You had it affecting stories for Marvel, where you had Captain America taking the super soldier serum out of his bloodstream and all that kind of stuff. So when you have Bane as a character and he was created in that world, where he gets his powers from, and the villainy that flows from even how he gets his powers, was very much, I think, tied to that time and place. Do you think that, as a character he still has that staying power, and it's not so much that you had to be in that time and place in order to understand his villainy as much?
Yeah, I think he's, a big surprise to me. I mean, he's stuck as a member of Batman's Rogues Gallery. I think he's still relevant, if not more relevant today than he was even then. Um, and his persona's kind of grown, as he's moved from, my and Graham Nolan's hands into the hands of other creators. Through film, through animation, through the video games. He's really taken on a life of his own in the minds of the fans. And these characters shift and morph with each new generation of people reading them, or playing them or watching them. And but I still think, yeah, I mean, he doesn't feel like a creation of strictly of his times, like he belongs in the 90s, any more than the Joker feels like a character who belongs in the 40s.
So I wanted to pick your brain just a little bit because, of course, I have written a couple of indie comics and self-publishing, but I was very interested to know if you have a standard way to plot a comic, or if it varies wildly with your artists or any other factors.
I use a standard full script for the most part. It's broken down by panel, all the dialogue, the sound effects, everything are there. It's broken down by page and panel. It's based on a script form that Robert Kanigher used at DC, because he gave me a comic script, and it was the first comic script I'd ever seen. So I was like, oh, well, this is how it's done. And that's, I use his exact format to this day. Occasionally, depending on the artist, I might, change the way I do things, but 99% of the time it's full script.
That's very interesting to hear. I've been interested in that for a little while. I went back because there are some things archived on the internet, for scripts from Alan Davis, where he writes very loosely, but of course he's also doing the art for some of the stories that he's working on, and
Right.
also, right now I'm working with Mike Gustovich, and he likes to work in a much looser style for plotting a book.
Mm.
Just again, he's an artist. I think he likes to do the pencils and the inks himself if he possibly can. So uh, when he's also
Right.
involved in the construction of the story, it takes a different turn for to how to plot it. But I'm with you. I very much like to plot out an entire thing. One of my other artists is Renzo Rodriguez, and he enjoys a full script like that. So very interesting to hear. So the other thing, speaking about Renzo, for me, anyways, the reason why Renzo and I connected was because I found that my writing very much matched up with his style of art. Do you have a preferred style of art that you would match with your scripts?
No, not really. I mean, I've worked with, a wide variety of artists and styles. Mostly, I'll look at the artist if I'm not, most times I'm familiar with their work already, but I'll look at what they've done and figure out, what's best um, for them. I try to tailor the art, the story to the artist as much as possible, so they can bring out their best. And I often ask artists, what is it you like to draw? So I can include things they particularly like to draw in a story, and what don't you like to draw. I mean, an astounding number of artists do not like to draw horses. Uh, so I avoid them in the story. So I don't want to make the guy, labor too much. But yeah, I mean, it's a collaborative medium all the way down the line. I mean, everybody's pulling an oar. Everybody should have a say in what happens. And I'm perfectly willing to look at artists. I'm not one of these writers who, when the art comes in, compares it to the script to see what changes they made. I just look at the comic, and if the comic works, it works.
I just wanted to mention about the whole drawing of horses thing. I'm actually working on a Conan type story right now with an artist, Jim O'Reilly, and he put on first right the front page, which is a splash page. My main character on a horse just falling over. It was spectacular. I love the fact that he was able to draw the horses for the first chapter in the way that he did. But my other question off of what you just said is, so I take it from what you're saying that you work in what would normally be called or considered the Marvel method, in that your story will morph to some extent when you get the art back in order to make it flow much more smoothly.
Yeah, not so much the Marvel method. I mean, the artist has a full script to follow, but I might, add or drop dialogue as is needed. I mean, when Scott Beatty and I did Robin Year One, we wrote the whole first issue, and then the artist was assigned. And when we saw Javier Polito's work, we completely rewrote the issue because we realized, hey, this guy is such an awesome storyteller. We need to cut some of this verbiage and stuff and allow him to tell the story more visually. So we cut out a lot of dialogue and altered a lot of scenes to emphasize the visuals over the text. So I'll make changes like that. I'm doing a series on Arctoons called Something Big, and I'm working with Frank Fosco, and more than almost any other artist I've worked with in the last few years, Frank will come back at me with suggestions about how to make the storytelling run more smoothly and things. And I always welcome them because he's always right because he's drawing it. He's changing it from my script into something that readers will read, and he's always got questions, and he's always willing to add panels and things like that to make things more clear, which is, you know, to anyone wanting to write comics, clarity is number one in comic storytelling. You have to be clear. And Frank helps me with that. He's always got great suggestions.
So when you began, I would just like to know if you can even really quantify this, but what would you say would be the major development within your writing style? And was it really affected by the stories that you worked on, or the types of stories that you were put on when you were writing for mainstream comics? Because again, I find that depending on what kinds of stories that I'm working on, I've written things like manuscripts for novels, and you've done stuff like working with J.R.R. Tolkien's material. How much does, I guess, to condense my question would be, how much does working with various types of mediums and stories change how you write your story? I don't know if that's a valid question or not.
Well, it all, I mean, it doesn't matter if I'm doing an adaptation or I'm getting onto an established franchise. Um, you have to find your hook into it. What you care about in that story. And I mean, I never, you know, except for on a couple of occasions when I've been offered work, I never say yes right away. I said, let me think about it because I want to make sure I have something to offer here. Basically it comes down to, do I care about these characters enough to write about them? Because I'm not going to write about characters I don't care about. And is there a way I can find a way to care about them? I mean, I wrote children's books before I got into comics, and you had to learn about those characters. These were all on established mainstream titles, characters. You had to find something you liked about them, so that because you're, especially in comics, you're writing for an audience. They don't like these characters. They love these characters, and if you don't share that love, it's going to show. It's going to show that you're just mailing it in. That you really don't give a crap. You're just putting the characters through their paces, and I never want to do that. And so a lot of times I'll turn things down because like I just don't care about that character, and I don't think I ever will. So I'm not I don't want to work on that. But then sometimes you have to find the love. I mean, I did a Transformers comics a few years ago. I was never a Transformers fan, and I was, the toys came out when I was an adult, so I really didn't care about any of that stuff. but I found a way into it. I found a way, I love the characters now. So
The other question I wanted to ask was there seems to be recurring themes throughout your work. You tend to, I think, gravitate towards and very deftly handle military subjects when you're dealing with, like, say, the Punisher, also with Alien Legion. You did Airboy for a number of years. You have a book out right now on Archaven called, I think it is Invasion 55, so which is centered around, again, Air Force. Um, are those the types of stories? Again, you're talking about what draws you in and what connects you to that story. Are those types of themes one of the things that you love about creating these military-like stories?
yeah, I mean, if I was told you can only write war comics for the rest of my life, I'd be perfectly happy. I liked war. I liked Sergeant Rock and things like that growing up, and also, I was of the age where, every dad in my neighborhood had served in World War II, and a lot of them in combat. And I would hear these stories. The dads would get together over a few beers on the front stoop, start telling stories, and I would. It was better than television. I'd sit there listening to these guys who had, been in the Army, the Navy, the Marines, Air Force. Like my dad was in the Army Air Corps, and to hear them tell these stories, and it's just sort of like is just part of me. And so I've always had an affinity for it, and because of that, all through my life, even to today, I will ask veterans questions. If I find out that a guy was in Vietnam or was in Afghanistan, or I'll ask questions, and they always appreciate being asked questions. I mean, everybody says, thank you for your service, but I think they appreciate curiosity more. It's like I'm trying to understand what you went through, and so I've always heard all of these great stories all my life, and it's what I think about when I'm trying to get that stuff down on the page, even if it's Alien Legion. Soldiers are soldiers.
That brings up a very interesting point. How much do you put into research for the stories that you're trying to write? I know that there are certain writers that are very, very heavy into trying to research some of the things. If I remember correctly, an interview with, like, Jim Shooter, he wanted to research a lot of things when he was writing some of the characters for Legion of Superheroes, when he started to introduce Karate Kid and things like that. So do you put a lot of research into a project before you start?
Well, like I said, I read a lot, and I have read a lot in the past, so I tend to go toward areas where that I'm more conversant with, so I don't have to do as much research because, like, I already understand this. Currently I was offered. I'm going to have to be doing some research in the future because currently somebody offered me a project set during the Revolutionary War, which is an era I'm familiar with, but I don't. I'm going to have to get into the language and everything else on that. But for the most part, I stay to things I already pretty much know. And as far as research go, most of my research is finding visual reference for the artist because I don't like to ask someone to draw something unless I've helped them. Why should they have to search for these images when I can provide them?
All right. So just a couple of questions on some of the books that you're working on right now. So you have a number of books up on Archaven Comics, which is specifically webtoons, or sorry, web comics. You also have
Yeah.
First Kill with Richard Meyer on Indiegogo, and Midnight's War on Kickstarter. Um, are you specifically looking to continue in a vein of crowdfunded comics, or you're just going wherever you can tell a good story?
Well, I'm working with a new company that I'm a part of called Spin Rack, and it's a multimedia comic company. We're going to be involved in comics as well as games. It's all based on for right now. It's all based on intellectual properties owned by myself and Graham Nolan, and we're hoping that this will take us beyond crowdfunding, so that we'll have comics that pre-fund themselves through other medium. And because the crowdfunding, I don't do crowdfunding. I mean, I work for guys who do it, but for me, it's way too much work. It's, I mean, uh, Graham Nolan, I've been friends with for almost 40 years, and he's great at it. He has a real talent for the promotion, marketing, fulfillment, and the rest of it. I just don't have those skills. So, but I work for guys like Richard Meyer, and I work for Arkhaven and people like that, and have a great relationship with those people and really support what they're doing because they're, I think, the most exciting segment in comics right now is the crowdfunding because it's so varied and it's so wild and woolly the way comic books should be, stepping away from the corporate into the truly independent comics. I mean, we're talking one man shows. These guys are doing everything. They're doing the publishing, the packaging, the formatting, and even mailing the damn things out. So it's a really exciting time to be in comics. It's totally different from when I started. I mean, it couldn't be more different. But I see it as expanding. I don't Crowdfunding is not going to go away, and through SpinRack, we're going to basically create a viable alternative to what's coming out of mainstream comics now.
So, from what you've just described for SpinRack, I take it you're going to have various forms of comics coming out. I Do you have any idea or any thoughts about where comics are going in the future? A lot of people are trying to push exclusively digital. I myself would rather stick to nothing but print. But do you have, with your experience, any insight into where you think that they're going?
Yeah, I don't think they're going toward digital because I get the royalty statements from DC, and I don't see digital growing. If anything, I think it plateaued a couple of years ago, and if anything, it's in decline based on what I can see from my because remember, I mean, digital comics are totally democratic. No one's you know you follow the creators you want to follow, and particularly at DC, you can go back forever and follow. You can you can say, well, I want to read every Gardner Fox written comic, and you can do that. And because of that, I think it's a barometer or a bellwether when I see my royalty statements. Have they gone up? Have they gone down? So I really don't think digital, and maybe that part of that is marketing because I saw a steep decline when DC stopped basically doing it on their own. Because I believe they've handed it off to another service, and at that point you're lost in the mix. So yeah, I think the future of comics is like the music industry. It already has. It's already broken up into basically disparate fan bases, and so you find your audience and you pursue them. And for comics, it's pretty good because there's a large underserved comic book readership that's turned away from what's being done at DC and Marvel because they don't care for it. It's not for them, but they still want to read comics, and so they're a ready audience and they're looking for something different.
You said that comics are becoming, well, in some sense, anyways, web comics are very democratic. Do you think, again, that would be part of what the future of comics looks like, where you would be probably, excuse me, you would be one of the last of a generation where you have a large name recognition, whereas when comics become much more diffused, wherein everybody is following their own small comic producer, there's no longer going to be that kind of name recognition anymore.
Well, I mean, you have stars within the crowdfunding universe. I mean, you got guys like Eric July and Richard Meyer, uh, and the Brian Polito. I mean, guys who basically they've made their fortunes in this. So they're like the superstars. They're the moguls in comics now. But the weird thing is, I mean, everybody's experiencing this now, where you hear about, oh, did you hear about, and it's somebody you're supposed to assume is famous, you know, but you've never heard of them, but they have millions of followers and everything else. It's like there's too much content out there to follow it all. It's like there's no big acts. I mean, and this is across entertainment. There's very few superstars. There's very few big acts that can pack a stadium. There's very few, assured best-selling comic book creators. And the thing is, when you look at it, when you look at fans of mainstream comics talk, and they'll talk about people like Jim Lee, and it's like, well, Jim Lee is from 30 years ago, but he's still like the big name. He's still the guy that moves numbers in the mainstream. But outside of the mainstream, in the alternate world of digital and crowdfunding and all the rest, you have people that are, who move the needle just as much, but they're just not well known to the mainstream readers. They're in their own neighborhood, if you would. I mean, we've all experienced this. I remember when people would talk about someone famous and everybody knew who they were, and that's just not true anymore. And that's never coming back because of the wealth, the fire hose of data that we're getting from everywhere.
So, off of that, would you see what is happening in crowdfunded comics and the explosion of content much more like the comics in your youth, whereas you had a much more of I guess, more than just Marvel and DC? You had a lot of horror style comics and different war kinds of comics and everything else. Are we getting back to the roots of something like that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even crowdfunding is about redundant publishing, which is what comics were based on. If something was popular, you did more of it. And when you look across crowdfunding and independent comics, what I call garage comics, there's every genre under the sun. Yeah, there's plenty of superheroes, but there's everything else too, from humor to autobiographical comics to horror to war to action adventure. A lot of pulp stuff. So it's a far more diverse selection than what you get from DC or Marvel, which are like almost 100% superheroes all the time. And that's not the way to do comics. Comics have gone through stages. I mean, in the 1970s, Sergeant Rock and Jonah Hex outsold Superman and Batman. I mean, by considerable amount. They were their number one and number two titles. And but it's like since then, it's been it's been all superheroes all the time, and I think to the detriment of the big two, because they're not attracting readers who aren't interested in superheroes. I think Vertigo is the last time a comic book company tried to seek a new audience, or think about something other than people wearing masks and capes.
The other question that I want to ask about the methods of storytelling that, are employed within the smaller companies and crowdfunded platforms that you're contributing to now. Um, Again, I like to write a story wherein there is some interplay between myself and the audience, in so much as I leave unanswered questions and things dangling, because I want the reader to have time to think about that in their minds and play with the ideas and stuff like that. Because to me, that's what a really good, engrossing story is about. But again, at some point, because for me anyways, I write every comic that I'm trying to produce in the same kind of world, wherein everything is tied together. But a lot of the crowdfunded comics that you see coming out are one shot, and they're in a universe that you're only going to see once, so they have to tie things up very quickly. Do you find that the deep, I'd say, storytelling that you would get within a continuous run is simply not there in a lot of what's being produced right now?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff that I get, asked to do, yeah, it's a one shot, so you're creating a reality for this one story. And that reality ends on the last page. I really liked back in the day when I had long runs, particularly at DC, and you could build a world and build this cast of characters and work in running gags and little Easter egg inside jokes for the regular readers and things like that, which I really don't get to do much of that, except at Arctoons. Arctoons, I can do long form stuff like that, continuous, basically like periodical stories. But yeah, the thing is, you gotta, it's always tougher to write short than long. I mean, uh, monthly comics are so forgiving, particularly if you're on a run, that you could stretch a story out or decide this is where the story ends here and everything else. But when you're working a shorter form, a graphic novel or a mini series, you got to have it all mapped out. The cliche of having a beginning, middle, and an end. Yeah, that's you got to have all that. Got to think in terms of a novel or a feature film as opposed to an ongoing serial.
So I don't know off the top of my head, what exactly, if you can remember, was the longest run that you had on a comic?
I would be Robin. I wrote 100 issues, in addition to annuals, specials, 80-page giants, miniseries. So I've probably written about maybe 130 Robin comics over my career.
So, well, of course, you've delved then more deeply into this character, I would say, than anyone else, just because that series was created with you. I just wanted to shout out Renzo Rodriguez, my artist, once again, because his inspiration was your Robin comics. He tells me this over and over
Oh
again.
wow, wow,
So
wow.
that's what he grew up reading. That's was I think his first comic he ever got was Robin #1 or one of the first comics. So I'm sure he would want me to mention that since I am talking to you that you are the inspiration. Your comics are the inspiration for his art. But
Oh,
to
that's
talk
cool.
about
That's cool.
talk to talk about that long runs and the ability to tell a longer story. Again, I fear to some extent that with the short attention span of a lot of people today, with again, as you had mentioned, the deluge of information coming at you. Um, do you think that there is a feasible way? I guess you would have to say yes because you're presenting the spinner rack idea, but a feasible way to bring comics back to long run form.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you have to engage the readers and basically get them in the habit. I mean, as a comic book reader myself, you probably experience the same thing. You get in the habit of reading a title, and then and then sometimes it no longer engages you. The Either you've grown out of it, or the quality has suffered, or there's been things happen in the comic that you don't particularly agree with because we so much. I don't mean politically. I mean we so much associate with these characters. We project ourselves in these characters, and sometimes as fans we're disappointed when they do something that we don't think they would have done. Things like that. Anything can make you walk away from a title, but my job and your job is to bring the reader in and keep them. And when I was on Robin, that's a long time to be on one book, but but my challenge was to keep the readers interested, to keep enough change and not repeat things, keep it from being formulaic, and just keep bringing them in. So yeah, I think we see people binge watching television shows, and I guess the idea is that if they binge watch this season, they're going to binge watch the next one. So comics are no different. You want to bring people in and keep them, and that's going to be the challenge, and it's always been the challenge. So from that aspect, nothing has changed.
So when I started my channel, and what I usually do with a lot of my videos is I talk about heroes and the concept of traditional ideas of heroes. And a lot of people ask me the different ways that, especially Marvel and DC, express the heroic ideal, whereas DC is much more of an idealistic version. Certainly, back in the day when you have been working at DC, an idealistic version of a hero, as Jim Shooter had said in one of his interviews. He said, when you're writing Superman for him, that's Sir Galahad. And if you can't write Superman as Sir Galahad, then get a new writer. Whereas with Marvel, you definitely have heroes with clay feet, and their heroic ideals slip. Which of those two kinds of heroic stories would you say you're more comfortable with?
Well, I was always a big Marvel fan. So those more, you know, human, more relatable characters. But that's the challenge of writing at DC, is to make those characters relatable, to give them those human moments. I never shied away from having humor in Batman stories, which usually it's not welcome. But it wasn't comedy; it was humor that grew out of the characters. One of my favorite sequences that I ever wrote was, um, Batman and Robin are on a rooftop as usual, and in the middle of the night, and a woman comes up to bring her laundry in. She's had drying on the roof, and she sees Batman and Robin and faints dead away. And Batman sees to her, because he's concerned. She's a citizen, and he tells Robin, fold her laundry while I look after her. So Robin folds her laundry and puts it in the basket for her while Batman revives her. And to me, that's like a moment, of all the Batman scenes I've ever written, that's my favorite, because it makes him human and relatable. Not just this scary psycho loner who lives in a cave.
That's very interesting because I find that for me, anyways, I very much was drawn to the Neil Adams Batman and the style of the detective that was almost a copy of, at some point, Sherlock Holmes, but wherein when I was reading your runs straight off the spinner rack for Batman and Robin, there was a definite shift within the character. You could see within a movement away from, to some extent, anyways, the analytical towards a more human type story. And I honestly think that's where the story of Bane and the defeat of Batman comes into the entire history of Batman. It is to bring him down to a human level that had really previously not been explored before. So I just want to ask the question, although I think it's probably self-explanatory, but that, I take it, is what you were trying to do when you generated those stories for Batman and for those long runs.
Yeah, I mean, I think an important part, and Marvel, Stan Lee always got this at Marvel and brought this to Marvel, was that, a lot of times these superheroes exist in a world of their own, outside even their own environment, and they don't seem to interact with anybody else but their own cast. And I always tried to make it so the characters, I mean, back in Marvel, Spider-Man would run into average citizens. Fantastic Four would have their mailman, or get in trouble with the landlord of the Baxter building, things like that. And it's like, it always made it seem more real to me. So I always tried to include that in stories where they're interacting with actual people, you know, the way you or I might. And, and I think that's important, because I see this everywhere. I see this in movies and television shows, as well as comics, where the cast of characters seem to operate in their own bubble of reality outside of what the rest of us experience. But everyone, every once in a while, you got to have your characters, get takeout, do something that you and I might do.
So we're coming up to about the end of our hour. So I just wanted to see if I could give the floor to you if there's anything that you wanted to talk about, either Spinner Rack or some of your comics on Archaven, or either one of your projects that you're working on right now with the crowdfunding. Is there any project that you want to talk up?
Well, I encourage people to check out Arctoons. It's free. It's we're approaching 11 million views, and it's every kind of comic you can imagine, every kind of genre you can imagine. And I'm particularly fond of Something Big that I'm working on with Frank Fosco, and another series called My Sister Suprema, which is kind of a superhero parody by myself and Anthony Gonzalez Clark. And like I said, it's free. They're in high res, and just look for Arctoons. I believe I sent you a link
Yes, I will
to the
put those
site.
in the description for anybody who wants to go and look those up.
Yeah, I mean, free comics. What? Woohoo!
uh, well, on that note, I just want to ask a question. I thought I was done, but I want to ask this question. Are you still one of those people who has long boxes full of comics? Are you still that
Oh yeah.
comic reader?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I read. I really should read more prose books, more nonfiction. I tend to read a bunch of comics. Yeah, I got. You can see behind me. I got shelves and shelves and shelves of stuff, and then yeah, I got a closet full of long boxes full of comics. A lot of them, comics I bought when I was a kid.
I find that the communities that are now springing up around what we're trying to do within crowdfunding, and I'm sure what you're trying to do with your new projects is, to some extent, a lot of people who have that same thing, where they have a long box stack sitting in their closet, and they just want to either read those over again or read stories that would make them want to read them over again. So that's something that I think is definitely advantageous to the future of comics. All right, well, I want to thank you very much for this interview. It has been very eye opening, and I will definitely, as I said, I will put those links in the description for your new books and your crowdfunded comics as well, and for the web comics, and urge everyone to check those out. All right. Well, thank you
Thank
very
you
much
very
for
much.
coming to the fourth stage and for your time.
Okay, thank you, and it was very interesting. Very great questions. Thank you.
So I want to thank Chuck very much once again for doing this interview with me. And I just want to remind everyone that the links are in the description for all of those books that Chuck was talking about that he's working on right now. And you can also find there the link for both of my graphic novels, Thomas Valiant and the Valiant Heroes. Both of those are available on the Valiant Heroes Indiegogo in-demand page, which, by the way, since it is shadow banned by Indiegogo, you can only find really by clicking the link, the direct link as I provide it to people. So you might want to click on that link in the description and go on over and see if either of my graphic novels are for you. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.